Hey guys, today I want to talk about another absolutely ridiculous Grandmaster Strikes build. A couple of weeks ago I covered one for Warlock in the form of the heal spam, but this one is going to be focused on Hunter. However, it's not too hard to adapt to the other classes either if you do play those, so I'll talk about that a little bit in the video as well. But mostly the focus is on Hunter today. Basically, this is just one of the most aggressive playstyles you can do, and you can maintain it because you can get an absolutely ridiculous amount of survivability verbs all stacked on top of each other using things on Hunter. So before we actually start, I do want to quickly give credit where it's due. This build was actually shown to me by a guy named Titus. He is another YouTuber, however he covers some other games as well as Destiny, but he has a ton of super difficult low man challenges on his channel. Anything from solo Grandmasters to low man master raids, he's done it. He's an absolute monster when it comes to thinking up these builds, and they are designed to tackle some of the hardest content in the game. They are legitimately good, and I highly recommend you check him out because he is awesome. But now, let's go ahead and look at the main basis of this build, and as you can see from the gameplay right away, that is going to be the Ergo Sum sword. More specifically, it's the Arc Conductor version of it. This is basically the Risk Runner offshoot of the sword, and the way it works is whenever you do a heavy attack with the sword, you get 5 seconds of damage resistance for Arc, and I believe it is 50% in that regard, which is super high for the current GM this week. But anytime there's Arc damage, it's going to be very effective. And more importantly, it sends out bolts to all the enemies around you, up to like 5 at once I want to say, or some amount like that. It has some pretty gnarly ad clear and does some actual decent damage, and is able to one-shot or two-shot most ads, even on the Grandmaster difficulty with that kind of scaling. And for anything that's not able to just be destroyed by these chains, it's still a sword, and you can use the sword attacks to kill them, and it works well enough on majors even. So I highly recommend getting this over using regular Risk Runner, even though it is a little bit harder to maintain the uptime of the perk without having any way of extending it. But because you're able to heavy swing so often, and it synergizes so well with Prismatic, it's super powerful. Now the other part of the build is obviously supporting such an aggressive weapon, because you have to be very close to a lot of very dangerous enemies, and so to support that we have a lot of things going on in our Prismatic Hunter subclass. The first one is we need to make good use of Facet of Purpose, and there's two main ways you can do that. You can either use Golden Gun to get Restoration on orbs, or you can use Silence and Squall to get Frost Armor on orbs. While Tether is a super strong super, it's very powerful, it only gives you Void Overshield, which is not a very effective survivability verb for Facet of Purpose. Next up, we also are going to be using the exotic class item. However, if you don't have access to the exotic class item, you could just use the base exotic and it's still pretty good. However, the class item version is going to be more powerful since you can have a second effect on top of it. And this is going to be making use of the Seer Terracnes Facade. This is the exotic helmet that gave you Woven Mail whenever you pop your grapple. However, on the class item version, it also applies whenever you use your Transcendent Grenades. We still actually use grapple in this build just because it's the fastest recharging grenade, and you can like instant trigger and stop the grapple to get half the charge back so that you have better uptime on it. And because grapple, if you hit something with it, counts as a melee, you're also able to get radiant using the facet on Prismatic as well. If you do have the exotic class item, you want to go for Inmost Light as your other perk than Seer Terracnes. There's not really a ton of super influential things in there, but having the better ability regen is really good. It just increases the uptime of your grenades and your dodges so that you can do even more ability spam, which is super powerful on this class. As for the other fragments, we're going to be using Facet of Protection as always. Since it's such an aggressive build, you're basically always getting this effect. And remember that it does stack with the Transcendent damage resistance as well, so ultimately you're just going to be even more powerful while you're Transcendent, as well as chucking the grenades that restore ammo to your Ergo Sum as long as you have the catalyst for it. We also use Facet of Hope to just get even better dodges. This basically just lets us use our melee ability more, which we decide to use the Shuriken simply because the Shuriken is a great overload choice, but if you don't need overload or you want a little bit more safety, you could also use the Threaded Needle, which is able to sever enemies super easily, which can be super helpful for staying alive even more if you need to make certain powerful enemies not able to damage you as much. And the final, most flexible slot, I went with Facet of Blessing just to get a little bit of healing started whenever I get a melee kill. It really wasn't all that common that I got them, it was pretty much only with the grapple. However, basically it was just something I could use in a pinch because I didn't have a lot of healing if I was using the Silence and Squall setup, so I was using that to get a little bit of healing out whenever I was using pure damage resist. And that pretty much covers the build abilities wise, so now let's go ahead and talk about the other weapons you could be using alongside your Ergo Sum and a little bit more details on the Ergo Sum itself that you want to use. The ideal roll on the ergo stem that you want is going to be a wave frame. You could see in the gameplay I had a light weight frame and I really didn't have any problems, but the wave frame is a little bit better just because it is a ranged attack and it also gives you a lot of movement for not being a sword with eager edge, which helps you just get hit less, which is super helpful just because you're trying to mitigate damage as much as possible. And since it's literally aiming for you, you have no need to be at all stable in your movement. You could be a total wackadoo and just take stuff out like that. Otherwise, you basically just want Swordmaster's Guard, and that's really all that matters on it, just so that you can get that regen rate on the heavy attack. As for your kinetic slot, I went with the Imperial Decree Trench Barrel Shotgun. This was one that Titus used as well in his build, however there are totally other options you could use as well. I wouldn't recommend going for a 1-2 punch unless you're using Synthoceps, however you can't have Synthoceps and Seared Terrachnes at the same time. If you do want a safer option, I highly recommend the Critical Anomaly, especially since right now we have Sniper Barriers. It means that the weapon with Chill Clip is able to insta-stun the overloads, and it will also stun barriers, and with Chaos Reshaped, it gets a very high amount of damage, which it is benefited by even more from the relic that increases our sniper damage for stacking hits. You could even use a Blinding GL in your kinetic slot if you really wanted to or felt like you needed it, however, I really don't think that need is here with how you are just basically invincible and able to kill things so quickly. And finally, in the heavy slot, this is a very flexible slot. You can kind of run whatever you like. I recommend running a rocket launcher. You could use bipod or explosive light, whatever you like. Just make sure it's matching the surges of the strike you're doing. Currently it's arc surge, so it is super easy to just use a matching arc rocket and have the scavenger applied to both the sword and the rocket. However, with all the ways to get ammo back on the ergo sum right now, you really don't need to have a scavenger for it whatsoever, even with double special. You could also use a grenade launcher if you wanted to be a little bit more divisible with your ammo, but it is important to remember that you get much less ammo per brick from grenade launchers than you do for rockets, so it is a lot easier to maintain a rocket than a grenade launcher in something like a GM. And you could even use a machine gun if you really wanted to, but I really don't recommend this. You don't really need the long range ag clear, at least for this strike. Maybe in other strikes you might want that, however you kind of lose out on a lot of your damage if you don't have a rocket, which can be a bit unfortunate for the setup, because I mean you do need to bring raw damage into GMs, it's just how it is, and that's kind of what a rocket or a grenade launcher can do for you. So in this last part we're going to talk about adapting this to other classes if you want to do that. First off, we'll talk about Warlock. I think that this is another pretty potent way to play it. However, you do have much less damage resistance, but you do get more healing on Warlock, so it's sort of a give and take. However, I think ultimately the build is at its best on Hunter and is its safest on Hunter as well. If you were going to go for Warlock, I would recommend running Song of Flame kind of as a panic button. If you're going to die, you just pop it and you become invulnerable pretty much. It's also decent if you're going into a super crowded room and don't really have a way to kind of start off the engagement. It lets you just run in there and not get punished at all for doing so. It is important to note that while you're in Song of Flame, you're going to lose most of your ability to do overload. You basically will have to use your sword to do it or hit with a Chill Clip sniper. On the Warlock build, I would recommend using the Critical Anomaly over the shotgun, simply so that you have a little bit more safety because the Warlock is a little bit more of a conservative playstyle due to the lack of damage resist that you're going to have. One thing I will give Warlocks credit on is that their Transcendent Grenade is absolutely ridiculous. While the Hunter Grenade definitely does more damage, the fact that the Warlock Grenade does constant stunning to overloads the entire time and still freezes, which makes it also able to do decent damage as well whenever it explodes at the end. It's definitely a very powerful grenade, and on top of that you can make it weaken using the facet of Dominance. The fragments are basically the same, except I decided to swap out the facet of Blessing for Dominance instead to get that weaken and jolt effect on the grenades. And I also decided to go with Getaway Artist as the exotic. I tried using Necrotics, but it didn't scale very well into GMs, especially on the class item where the damage is not scaling upwards, and Necrotics on their own are not really a ton of value for something that you can't regen super quickly. So I did decide to take Getaway Artist for that one. Basically it gives a little bit of extra grenade regen by getting the Arc Soul hits, and also allows you to get amplified on demand, which is super helpful for moving objectives like the ball through the tube room with the electric things during the strike. On top of that, this season, Amplified is also giving a damage resistance effect of 30% as long as you have the mod enabled on your artifact, which is absolutely ridiculous and something I wasn't able to build into the Hunter build. I wasn't able to give up anything I had on Hunter to get an arc ability on so that I could get Amplified, because if you do have any sort of arc ability equipped on Prismatic, you're able to get amplified on arc multi-kills, including with weapons, which means that ergo sum would still give a ridiculous amount of amplified uptime. Now, when it comes to Titans, I'll be honest, overall, I don't think they're very powerful. They do definitely have some merits, and I think they're probably at their best in GMs compared to what they are in other activities. But there's just such a lack of survivability that Prismatic Titan has, and there's not really any other subclasses on Titan making it up. But the Prismatic on Warlock and Hunter have insane amounts of tankiness, and then the Titan one is just totally lacking. So I tried to run this build on Titan, and I had a hard time staying alive even with teammates. That being said, some people have been able to solo this GM using this build on Titan, so if you are really good at staying alive and you could just dodge all the shots Matrix style, you'll probably have a good time doing this on Titan. That being said, I wanted this to be a video about an easy to use aggressive build, and I don't think it's nearly as easy to use on Titan as it is on Warlock and Hunter, so we're not going to be covering it. But if you are on Titan and you are trying to just make it work, the setup is basically just surrounded Synthoceps on Consecration and Knockout. So yeah, that is going to do it for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed and you got yourself a new powerful build to farm GMs super fast. Hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.